right, so I guess we'll start the next panel. This ought to flow quite smoothly out of the previous panel. Two of the panelists are sort of long-time personal heroes of mine, and another, I'm sure, is destined to become such a personal hero. Most of you probably know Jeff Madrick. I sometimes think of him as sort of the successor to Jamie's father in essentially rendering economics and economic policy accessible to a general readership without, in so doing, sacrificing rigor or detail. Emma Coleman Jordan is sort of a pioneer, if not indeed the founder, of the sort of academic study of banking and finance from a social justice point of view. And then Marshall Steinbaum, who's a bit too young to be quite as venerable or storied as his co-panelists, nevertheless does fantastic work at the Roosevelt Institute, and I suspect that that's destined to become just as important and well known over time as is Jeff's and Emma's work. So with that, we'll get started, and I guess we'll proceed from right to left in a kind of a hopeful trajectory. So we'll start with from your point of view, right to left. So we'll start with Jeff, and then to Emma, and then over to Marshall.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate being here. It's been quite an interesting symposium so far. I hope we can keep it going. I need my glasses. So I'd like to begin with it. Well, I'd like to begin with a couple of points. I'm going to not follow Eileen. I've just been reading Alice O'Connor, if anybody knows the poverty historian, so I have Alice in my mind. But Eileen talked about how she would not talk about her agenda, and then she gave us her entire agenda at the end, which I appreciate, because I think was on comment. I want to say one thing about Big Short, the movie. Anybody who relies on the movie Big Short is being misled. You better read the book. It's way more complex and accurate than the movie. The movie was an unfortunate distortion. I wanted to tell Eileen that in 1974 or something, not long after I got out of grad school, I wrote my first cover story. It was for Business Week, and it was called The Rise of the CFO. Mm-hmm. So it was already happening. And it's in direct line to what's happening today. So I just wanted to make a couple of points. There were a couple of other points, but I'm sure they're superfluous. I'm a little disappointed by the Democrats already. I think they are not, contrary to what the ex-congressman said, they are not attacking the problem. They don't seem to fully appreciate the problem. I think health care is a very important issue, and it won a lot of votes, so I'm glad about that. They talk about infrastructure and talk about not believing things. Nobody in America quite believes we're going to get an infrastructure package. We haven't gotten one, and we need it desperately. What they should be talking about, and what the main issue is, and I think it's been referred to, they should be talking about jobs and wages in America. That's why Donald Trump ran. He ran partly because he gave an opening to vulgarity, which I suppose is a deep part of the human character, racism, the hatred for Obamacare, which was about the most irrational thing I've seen in a while. That's turned because people now know they benefit from Obamacare. Maybe we'll get a public option. But the real issue is wages and jobs and bitterness over wages and jobs, and he appealed to that with talk about tariffs and so forth. Democrats have to come out of the chute talking about jobs and wages, pure and simple. I don't want to oversimplify, but I guess I am. There has to be a program to tell people Democrats are going to get them jobs. Now, there's a problem there, of course, and it was alluded to earlier. The problem is the deficit. People think you can't talk about social programs, and the ex-congressman tells us, well, maybe that's opening up a little bit. I sure hope so. The Obama administration, centrist as they were, joined the argument for austerity, and that cost us dearly. Don't think they didn't join the argument for austerity, and don't think they were just pushed by the Republicans to do that. Erskine Bowles was the Democratic representative on the Balanced Budget Committee named before Obama even became president. That was not a response to Republican pressure. That was a response to something in the president's mind and his economic advisors, and I suppose Rahm Emanuel, that it's something they had to abide by, and it was good economic policy. It hurt us terribly because we didn't get social policies we need, and we now face a very big deficit. How are we going to get those social policies? I think the Democrats better have a little meeting to talk about that, because that's going to be a big issue. And I think they are avoiding jobs and wages talk because they don't want to deal with that problem. They don't want to deal with what the government spent. There's been an abdication of responsibility, I believe, on the part of progressive economists because they haven't really explained this economic the strength of the economy so far. There's a lot of talk about a sugar high. There have always been sugar highs. I don't think it's only a sugar high. I think a lot of it is Keynesianism. A big deficit leads to rapid economic growth. And we haven't hit a point where higher interest rates might undermine that growth. I don't think that's likely. I think it might undermine the stock market, which is an indirect way of undermining economic growth. And in fact, I'm not so sure the president is going to enjoy this economic ride. But in any case, without a clear theory about what's going on, without a notion about how important it is to have social programs, and by and large ignore the deficit to the extent you can, we're not going to get what we need. And if we get what we need, partly if we do start getting better jobs and higher wages, we'll start paying some of that, we'll start ameliorating some of that deficit. But the point is the American people need this, and we need this more than we need lower deficits. I think the argument, as Eileen said, we know the agenda we need. The agenda we need includes dealing with labor rules, like overtime rules, like fairness of schedules and so forth. We hear them a lot. The EPI just did a very good list of those. Labor organizing. Business has beat the heads. It's not even really an issue in the media, but business beat the heads of labor union organizers across the nation with the support of the federal government, by and large. The minimum wage is, over time, we've got to get to $15 an hour. I don't think there's any doubt. And it's a critical pillar of the future. I think we've got to start talking about industrial policy openly. That's a good example of what was suppressed over the last 15 or 20 years. You couldn't talk about industrial policy. I remember Felix Rohatyn, who was not an anti-capitalist by any means, trying to talk. This was a guy who made a lot of money, who helped New York out of debt, who was widely regarded, was not necessarily Mr. Purity. In fact, probably most of you don't know this. He used to be called Felix the Fixer in his former incarnation, but came out strongly for, I think, decent politics. He wanted to be on the Fed board, and they weren't going to let him be let him be vice chairman of the Fed. He used to try and get industrial policy into the general argument. It was a dirty phrase. You couldn't do it. Industrial policy means subsidies for manufacturing, for green technology, for some healthcare and R&D support. It means a government that is active and recognizes that private enterprise won't do it all, and in fact, it never did do it all. And I think Mazzucato's books, or now 2 books, are good guides to how important government was in the development of innovation that eventually led to productivity growth. We should keep that. You don't have to read it. Take my word for it. Government matters a lot, and in this regard. So we need this industrial policy. We need infrastructure. We have to talk more about how we can actually get it and what it will actually mean and how it can produce fair jobs for all, men, women, and people of color. And we have to talk about income supports. What distresses me most is we are not coming up with policies for the lower end, for the service workers who don't make a lot of money. There's been some legislation put forward. I don't know if it's going to pass for home health care workers and so forth. The Democrats really have to turn their attention to helping these people and figuring out ways to support income. There are differences about this in the left-wing camp. Annual minimum benefits or cash allowances or job guarantees. I like job guarantees. We have to have a robust debate about that. It has to be a priority in the Democratic agenda. Paid family leave, of course, has been a priority. We're not getting it. We're not getting it anywhere. And I want to say one other thing. I want to add to Eileen's comments about finance. Finance really did, and I think you're going to address this, so I'm not going to talk too much about this, but finance really did suppress wages. The leading edge were the leverage buyouts, which began in the 1970s and grew in the 1980s and then became private equity, which was by and large the same thing. You borrow all that money, and in order to pay the debt back, you suppress wages or fire people or strip the company and stop paying R&D. Eileen's been a leader in the research on this, but there's been no question it's been a major contributor to low wages. So is Federal Reserve policy, which was until a couple of years ago too tight for this economy and led to wage suppression. Indeed, the objective was wage suppression. I think some of that's reversed, thank goodness, and I want to say one thing about poverty, which is never discussed in regard to the economy. There is a huge, especially child poverty. In fact, I'm just finishing up a book on child poverty, which is, as you know, the highest or almost the highest among rich countries, highest rate among rich countries in the world today. And it's 14 or 15% in America. If poverty were measured properly, it would be more like 25%. One of the great scandals in America, of course, is the official poverty rate is an immoral, unsophisticated, ridiculous measure. And that's only now being talked about. What I'm trying to get at is poor people are a great potential resource for the economy of America and to increases in productivity, and especially poor children. And what we're essentially doing is cutting off, so it's not 25%. We're cutting off 15% of the population from contributing adequately to this economy. It's a great unused resource. So let's think about poverty. The wonderful historian Michael Katz called poverty the third rail of politics. Nowhere was that clearer than in the recent Democratic campaign, where poverty was hardly mentioned, and though allegedly the main interest of the Democratic contender was child poverty, that contender hardly mentioned it. In fact, I think she only came up with a proposal 3 weeks before Election Day. That's an economic issue. It's foremost a moral issue and an issue of minimizing, ruining kids' lives, but it's a major economic issue. So I'm going to start there. I want to quickly say, let's talk about housing also. The housing policy in America is a travesty, and I better not fall into the trap of trying to mention everything that has to be done. I was asked to do the New Deal, and the New Deal covered an extraordinary amount of territory. Extraordinary. We have as many problems today, though people are not suffering as much for the most part, but they are all critical problems. I'm going to stop on what I think is the critical problem, wages and jobs. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be in this group of thinkers. It gives me an opportunity to pull together new thoughts and to reflect on the things you've said. I want to focus my attention. I do regulation of banking, and I've taught for more than 30 years and written in the area of secured transactions and commercial law. I also have written a case book on the idea of economic justice, race, identity, and culture, how this pervades the way in which we approach problems and how this creates gaps. So for this set of comments, I've got a couple of 4 points that I want to start with, and then I want to go into my major theme. I've been told 12 minutes. I'm going to keep it to 12 minutes, so I may be hitting some of these quickly. First point is, in advice to the Congress, beware of financial innovation. And the idea of innovation is a mask for exploitation, avoidance of regulation, capture of the levers of power to dismantle bad actors. Secondly, there is old wine in old bottles. Watch out for the return of the radical deregulatory agenda. It hasn't gone away. We still hear, even from Democrats, faint whispers that sound amazingly like radical deregulatory agenda, soft regulation. Capital requirements, they are good, but then when you get to the point of enforcement and oversight, we find that the very largest banks, with the bank supervisors at the Fed, this summer they were taking the stress tests, and we learned that the Fed was coaching them how to pass the test, how to rejigger their balance sheets so that the tests could be passed. So there are various forms of the radical deregulatory agenda. It isn't always the face of Alan Greenspan. Even he admitted under withering questioning by Waxman that maybe he made a mistake in his fundamental assumptions. Well, that seemed to be a personal confession, because the economists, many of whom are not here, that the ideas are still firmly embedded in the discipline. The third point I want to just touch on, mention it, and then I'll go through some examples in a minute. Beware of racial exploitation that is posing as new opportunity, that people who are excluded from financial transactions now have the opportunity to participate. Well, I was at a conference at Georgetown just recently in the last couple of weeks, and one of my idols in the economics profession is George Akerlof. And George is very clear. His book, Fishing for Fools, is about what happens when you take off the regulatory guardrails, that the natural state of the market is not simply patterns of competition, rational choice, efficiency, but instead predation. And so in predicting who will be preyed upon, you have to know our racial history. You have to know how our country has been built, how the economic structure is supported by continuing predation. So this leads me to the last overview point, and that is, don't be enthralled by the discredited economic expertise that is embedded in fancy macroeconomic models. These models look good until they're put to the test of predicting something real. Interest rates, maybe, but not the collapse based on racial exploitation and predation. So let me go on now to talk about my central comment, and that is financial complexity is not an accident. It was great to hear the congressman talk about the way in which a lot of the proposals that led up to the financial crisis didn't make any sense at all. And some people think that was an accident. I don't think it was an accident. It was a central strategy of the financial sector. The financial sector relied upon two disciplines primarily, economics and the quants in mathematical models. And their reliance then gives them the expertise and advantage of creating complexity that Louis Ranieri told the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, nobody will understand this. Well, again, that wasn't an accident. That was a built-in feature to create financial instruments that were impenetrable. So that strategy is built upon another layer, and that layer is the power of disciplinary training and the grip on ideas of disciplinary training in economics or mathematics. I had a student, about 5 years ago. He and I got to be very close. He took a couple of classes of mine. He was a quant on Wall Street. His basic training was as a person who was doing physics. Well, he told me, we started talking about things related to the financial crisis, and he said to me, those models that quants use were not intended to do financial prediction work. They were intended to describe and make assessments of the movement of molecules, the way in which physical science operates. And then quants, of course, looking for the major advantage of working on Wall Street, the compensation and the advantage which that gave them, they flooded out of those laboratories, and they could have their own areas of control within the major financial companies. So complexity is an intentional power-grabbing strategy, and it is reinforced by the disciplinary grip on ideas. I'm always surprised to see that many of the macroeconomic maxims are still in charge of most of the thinking in regulatory agencies. And so when we hear that nobody could have predicted, well, not with the tools you had, you couldn't have predicted. I did a review of, that's a nasty, one of the solicitors who get your number, they go to your home number and then ping over to your cell phone, and it is, I had it turned off, but they must have ways of activating and a turned off cell phone.
Especially if it's yours.
Yeah, especially if it's mine. Okay, so this complexity strategy is important to plan for alternatives. And there are some areas where Rob Johnson and the Center for New Economic Thinking is one of those hubs of alternative ways of thinking about economics. That has to be deepened, sustained, and I know Rob, as his previous work with the Senate Financial Affairs Committee, he has a long history in the government sector, and he's a macro economist. He is trying to unpack, trying to undo, bring together people who have that project. So I also want to add that complexity of design of the individual products, so that trust-preferred securities, securitization, and the uses of tranches and introduction of words that are vaguely foreign is a way of putting a smoke bomb over regulatory penetration and oversight, so that you get the advantage with this complexity of having off-balance sheet transfer of risk to structures that are not regulated at all. And I took a look recently. Sheila Bair, I spent some time with her at a conference recently. We were planning this together. And she said that she didn't know about the off-balance sheet liabilities and assets, mainly assets, of Citibank until just shortly before the financial collapse. This is the head of FDIC. So the idea of complexity is a disciplinary advantage. It is also a structural advantage in that it can permit the creation of the shadow sector. I looked to see, well, what's become of the shadow sector? Has it been reduced? Is it still operating at full force? Well, it's still there, and it isn't any more regulated than before. So I will say in closing that when we look at the uses of complexity, we should be thinking about unpacking the disciplinary grip on ideas and thinking. So I'll conclude by saying that we still have Section 13.3 of the Federal Reserve statute that provides for emergency rescues, and that section hadn't been used until this financial crisis. So we have a power that's still there, and there's some good people like my dear idol, George Akerlof, who's still advocating for the need for this rescue power that is an essential part of government regulation. And I'll have more to say about race and exploitation, perhaps in answer to the question. It's great to see you, Mersa, as well, and your wonderful work as well. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me today. I wanted to use this opportunity to discuss my work on student debt and labor market credentialization and the racial inequities inherent in that. I sort of share some of the priorities of my fellow panelists and members of the last panel, and having been a sort of classically trained economist, my sort of top professional goal in life is to show that the economics profession has really gotten it wrong. And so most of my work is actually not about student debt and the false theories that underlie our policies in this area, but on antitrust policy and the regressification of that's taken place over the last 30 years. And I would be very interested to discuss that work, because I think it's a rising fight with which we need to engage with some of the other people who are here at future event or informally. The work that I'm talking about now is contained in a publication of the Roosevelt Institute that we completed basically a month ago. And the idea is that there's sort of a economic hypothesis operating in the background of this country's student debt policy, which is that student debt is good debt. You take on, if the government kind of expands the student loan program and makes credit available to people who wouldn't otherwise be able to go to university, then people can take on that debt, get a credential, and then that credential will essentially pay for itself in the labor market. And that, I think, is redolent of the false thinking that led to the housing crisis, where there's this idea that richer people have more education, richer people have more own houses, and so therefore it must be their education that caused them to be rich, therefore it must be their housing wealth that caused them to be rich. So our solution to inequity is, and our egalitarian public policy is to extend credit in order for people who aren't rich to buy those assets and get and by that means become rich. And I think we ran that experiment in housing, and it turns out there are very good reasons why there's structural inequity in home ownership, and that can't be rectified by extending credit. And we're now currently running that experiment in higher education policy, and there's good reasons why that doesn't work as well. Now, in the case of housing, the nature of this, the asset is that it's tangible, and the loans that finance it are securitized by that asset. And so when the asset declines in value, you get a financial crisis that suddenly reduced the price of securities that were securitized by home mortgages. That's not going to happen in student debt, in the student debt context, because student debt is not securitized, so there's no sort of deflationary dynamic at play there. I think the equivalent of the popping of the housing bubble in student debt is a slow motion credentialization of the labor market. So for any given job, you need more credentials, and therefore you need more student debt in order to obtain that job. If you sort of flip the analysis around, we have a sense that the labor market, that wages in the labor market are stagnant. I think there's no doubt about that. But one thing that hasn't really been part of that is that we shifted the cost of higher education from states and institutions and employers and on to individuals and workers. So for these stagnant wages, we're essentially requiring people to pay a higher and higher toll in order to get access to those jobs. And not surprisingly, that results in them rightly feeling as though that they've been made worse off. Not their wages may be stagnant, but their overall wealth is declining. So that sort of I should absolutely not neglect to mention the racial aspects of this, just as they were so apparent in the housing crisis. They are quite apparent. Any sort of cursory look at data on student debt, and especially on who's delinquent on student debt, will tell you that there's a strong racial component to this. Recently, this has been kind of I don't know how many people in this room sort of come from the higher education policy space, but I'm guessing a good number of you at least come from the higher education realm. There was kind of a longstanding belief that there are, higher education especially is a root of social mobility and economic improvement generation after generation. And so this sort of whining about student debt must be the result of, it can only be the result of sort of privileged people complaining about, they would rather not pay off their debt, but basically it's what caused them to be employed. And so, they should recognize that this is sort of economically beneficial to them. That is just kind of completely overlooking the reality of more and more people needing to take on student debt because of rising tuition and because of the credentialization of the labor market. The routes into the labor market that would previously have avoided higher education and therefore avoided student debt are basically non-existent. So now you need, we say to people that if you want a good job, then you should go to college. People take on a huge amount of debt to go to college, and then they're told, well, actually, you need to go to graduate school, or you need a sort of another dose of even more expensive education, and people feel like they're, as I would put it, trying to sort of climb or ascend a down escalator, and that's not actually the route to social mobility. I think that's the reason why it has such racialized dynamics is because of longstanding discrimination in the labor market and the background of huge disparities in household wealth and family wealth. So on the one hand, when you think of that, we've shifted the cost of higher education from institutions, employers, and the state onto individuals. What that means is that, by and large, white families have a background of family wealth, so they can essentially pay for that increased expense on behalf of their children. Or if not, if it is not through that channel, when people sort of run into problems in the labor market and would otherwise fall into delinquency, they can kind of fall back on a family that's willing to help them out. That option doesn't exist when your family is basically has no wealth, no ability to kind of contribute to this new expense that young people have to take on. And between that and the difficulty of finding jobs that is especially severe for people of color, you've got white people will graduate from college and take on and sort of find jobs as the student debt system is designed to say, well, okay, you took on this debt and now you'll start paying it back when you enter the labor market. We've seen that there's already a disparity in how much student debt undergraduates have upon leaving. That is about $7,000 between white and black undergraduates. That disparity rises to $25,000 something like 5 years after graduating because the white graduates tend to start paying it off, and black graduates, may earn less and so be less able to pay it off, and especially have to go on to more education and therefore leave the labor market again, take on more student debt, and therefore sort of start their economic lives in a larger hole. So I'll sort of end by talking about some of the solutions to this, which I think have gained too little attention in the public debate. We've all heard a lot about free college, and I think that that's important, but I think there's sort of an unfortunate tendency to sort of think that, well, we can roll back the kind of neoliberalization of the university and the shifting of the cost of education from employers and institutions and the state onto individuals. We can shift that back by essentially pumping federal money into state higher education systems, and that will replace the lost state funding, and all of these problems will go away. And I don't think, much as I think it is definitely true that defunding higher education on the part of the state created a sort of privatized higher education system that played a substantial role in causing the student debt crisis, I don't think that can be so easily reversed by simply replacing the lost state funding that has now been gone. I think the credentialization, the incentives for institutions are to credentialize, and that won't go away if you pump money in. So they want to create more degrees that people need to get in order to get jobs. And then the other thing is, so that bespeaks a larger agenda of regulating institutions and what kinds of education they're providing and what kinds of education they're not permitted to provide. I think we also need to, frankly, desegregate higher education. I've said before that we need a Brown versus Board of Education for higher education. This idea of credentializing the labor market basically means that you have to go through this process of higher education in order to enter the labor market, and everyone relies on their work to make a living. And so we can't have a system where that is that crucial aspect of the economy and of society is so deeply segregated as it is now. The premise of Brown v. Board is that we can't segregate something so fundamental as education. It really arose in the context of a high school movement that universalized secondary education in this country, and the idea behind that desegregation movement was to say, well, this thing that everyone has now, at least in the South, is only available on the basis of race, and that's not tolerable for something that's so fundamental to society. And we are in the situation where the same is now true of tertiary education, and the segregation of it is absolutely nationwide. A lot of attention has been paid to the segregation between for-profit institutions and nonprofit institutions, but that segregation is very true even within public university systems. And I don't think, again, public funding or federal funding to replace lost state funding it really speaks to how to solve that problem of segregation. And then finally, I think we need to talk about reeling in the problem that credentialization has created in the form of a student debt crisis that has now caused its own economic problems. So people are suffering under student debt. Even a well-designed free college system will help a great many people, but it won't help the people who've now kind of fallen between the cracks of the bad higher education, bad student debt system that we currently have. And in the last administration, the real kind of panacea for this was supposed to be income-based repayment, which is fine, but it has been shown to definitely not solve the problem of the burden that people are laboring under of student debt. Even with these programs being available, delinquency has continued to increase. It's especially, it's astronomically worse for people of color, and it isn't solved by completion. There was a lot of sort of hope that the problem was people aren't completing college, and if they would kind of get over the finish line, then they would be able to avail themselves of the higher education, of the college wage premium, and thus delinquency would no longer be a problem, and that is definitely not true. So even the problem that income-based repayment is designed to solve, delinquency, is not actually currently able to solve that problem, and I don't think that simply reducing payments to a given share of your income really can address the root cause, which is this sort of burden that prevents you from living an economic life, from building assets, from home ownership, from household formation, from saving for your own retirement, or from your children's higher education. So we've created this weight around the legs of new entrants into the economy, into the labor market, and we can't really have solved the problem of the institutional setup of higher education without having removed that weight.
Do we have any time for a couple of questions before Bill starts, or should we?
A little late, but I think we can do a couple of quick ones.
Okay. Sure.
I have one question for Dr. Jordan and one for Dr. Steinbaum. Dr. Jordan, when the next economic crisis unfolds, if it's as big as the last one, perhaps even worse, would you recommend that the new Democratic majority in the House bail out the banks again? Or would you recommend that they let Rome burn in order to rebuild it not for the Caesars but for a republic? And to Dr. Steinbaum, I'm very happy to hear that you're attacking the fundamentals of economics, especially where you got your PhD from. But it makes me wonder how much progress we've made at that front, because if you're talking about trying to change reality, we perhaps first also have to change the culture and the way of thinking, and how neoclassical economics sort of still dominates the entire field, including undergraduates who major in economics and later on continue as professionals, as staffers, as sometimes politicians, drink the Kool-Aid of voodoo economics written on a napkin. How do you change that? Personally, I despair, because my own university, the history of economic thought is no longer offered. Political economy classes do not exist. Even economic history is no longer offered. I suggest to my colleagues in the history department, perhaps they could offer it, and they're all cultural historians. They say, well, no, that's something for the economics department. So what's the way out of that?
Okay, I can answer or respond to the first question, and because it poses a central dilemma that we have as a nation, and that is when you have financial institutions that have enormous political capital, they are able to shape the rules, both of their creation, their oversight, and eventually their dismantling. And so we still have, because of this political capital, we still have a shadow banking sector that has not gone away, that is in charge of capturing off-balance sheet activity. And so when you say, what should we do? Should we let Rome burn, I think was your metaphor. How should we respond to a big failure? I would agree with you that the student debt problem is not going to have the same characteristics of the housing crisis, but we are likely to see unexpected failures that, because of global interconnectedness, which is a permanent feature of the way financial institutions interact, and interconnectedness of the regulators as well. Because of that, we still have unregulated sectors. And what I like to call the Bernanke doctrine, which is that you have to treat the off-balance sheet entities the same as the social safety net entities that we acquired during the New Deal. So that's the dilemma. And so the question is, how do we deal with that? We've got a structure that promises to let banks fail, but it hasn't been tested. And I think if we have an interconnected crisis where the failure is rippling through the entire economy, the temptation is going to be there to rescue the failed large institutions.
Great.
So I just think it's going to happen.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah, to speak to the sort of intellectual corruption, or if you want to go so far as to call it that, of the economics profession, first of all, I guess, the problem is big and amorphous, and I'm not exactly sure how to characterize it. I think that on the one hand, you have, many people in public, and especially of young people, who sort of realize that the nostrums that they've been taught really have nothing to do with reality. And the issue is the sort of what Congressman Miller was referring to, the sort of intellectual monopoly and that this ideology has over policymaking, not so much that people are deluded. Or a large majority of, say, economic students are deluded. On the other hand, I think a lot of the problem is actually tied to what I was talking about with the neoliberal university, that the sort of the one department or the one set of departments that is able to sort of grow and expand and take over territory is those that can raise money from outside sources. And we all know that they one way to get money from outside sources is to tell them what they want to hear, and they're very happy to, they're very happy when a department that might be saying things that they don't like so much gets replaced to effectively have their turf eaten by scholars who, if not say exactly what they want to say, at least don't say things that they don't like, or don't study the questions that might raise uncomfortable issues. Now, I'm somewhat heartened by, I was trained relatively recently, and, there's, people within economics kind of point to this empirical revolution that's going on in the discipline. Unfortunately, one tendency is to sort of take that empirical revolution as an excuse to sort of further the economics, the ideological tyranny of kind of old ways of thinking. So even as the nature of the empirical revolution is that, basically, remember that thing that we told you 25 years ago? Like, that's actually wrong, but you should listen to us now. And the fact that we are the ones telling you that it's wrong means that the overall power of this discipline to set the policy agenda should be reaffirmed and strengthened, and we should ignore the fact that what the whole nature of this this advance is that everything that we did last time you gave us power turned out to be false. I hope that what we can get out of this, this is really the motivator for my work on labor market monopsony, is that to undermine the assumptions that have guided policy. So, for example, just to speak in the higher education and student debt, the idea is, what you get paid in the labor market is directly related to what you are worth in terms of your skills to your employer. And so the role of higher education is to make you more valuable to your employer by giving you more skills. We know that what you're paid in the labor market has nothing to do with your skills. It's based on your employer's ability to extract value from you, to knock down the wage below the marginal product, to use the lingo, and there's all sorts of follow-on implications of that fact. This is especially, it's especially easy to exploit people who are historically disadvantaged. I can just, if you taking that insight into the halls of power when labor market policy is being set, into the halls of power where student debt policy. I would say the federal student loan program is the federal government's most ambitious labor market policy of the last several decades. Labor economists don't see it that way, but that is what it is, and it's failed because it's premised on this false assumption about why people get paid what they are paid. And I think I've had at least some success. I don't know exactly how durable or influential it will ultimately be in sort of saying, to higher education policy experts, you all think that what you're solving is the economy's skills gap, but let me tell you that the skills gap doesn't exist, and the labor economics that underlies that sort of presentation of the problem is totally flawed. That's kind of a revelation and in some ways a liberation to people who have been kind of locked in terms of policymakers who've been locked in a cage based on what economists said they are and aren't allowed to do.
Can I say a quick word about this? The mainstream, a lot of people in this room have written about the failures and flaws of mainstream economics. I myself wrote a book recently about that. Mainstream economics has learned how to support the profit-making establishment. That's by and large what it comes down to, and it provides sophisticated rationalization for what they do. And that's a hard relationship to break.
Thanks, guys. I guess that's it.